Hello, my name is Michael Dewan Herrick. I'm a psychotherapist and a life coach in private practice in London. This is the 9th video in a series under the title Questioning Woke Psychotherapy. In this video, I'll be talking about victim mentality and how woke psychotherapy, as informed by critical social justice, tends to promote victim mentality. I'll also be talking about how therapists can work more effectively with clients when they may have been victimized by an injustice, by a social injustice. So before launching into everything, I want to reiterate something I've said in previous videos, just so I'm clear, you can be clear about my intentions. My first intention is to provide a robust critique of woke psychotherapy without holding back. The second intention is to preserve the best of its intentions, recognize and preserve the best of its intentions and any ideas that seem valid and useful, to preserve those. The third intention is to begin to suggest an alternative and I believe more effective way to work with clients who may have experienced social injustice and victimization. As for the best of intentions of woke psychotherapy, I believe it wants to recognize and address instances of social injustice, confront that, and respond to the suffering and victimization that can cause people who show up as psychotherapy clients. Who could deny that social injustices happen, that they should be confronted, or that those who suffer them should be supported? So I'm in agreement with that. There are a lot of details to work out, but as a fundamental intention, I'm on board with that. If you clicked on this video because you were hoping to hear me simply bash woke psychotherapy and get that satisfaction, you might be a little disappointed, because I'm also trying to build bridges like the one I just suggested. The thing is that I believe that most people who subscribe to wokeism don't think it through completely. They're not aware of all the implications. They know that injustices occur and that something ought to be done about it, and those who are victimized should be helped and supported. If what they hear is that they're wrong, that this is all wrong, they're not likely to listen. They're likely to think that the person providing the argument is part of the oppressive class, trying to protect their power. And they might not be wrong about that. They could be right. But if what they hear is a more nuanced approach, they might be more willing to listen. They might more likely be persuaded to consider an alternative that preserves the good intentions that they have. In any case, I think it's much more difficult to dismiss an argument like that. Okay, let's take that as a starting point. Now what I want to do is discern the difference between social activism and psychotherapy. Social activism focuses primarily at the level of oppressed groups. When it seeks justice, it is seeking change in institutions, change in systems of power, and it's seeking justice for groups of people who are affected by that. Psychotherapy focuses on the individual, an individual's need. That individual may or may not be part of an oppressed group, but the psychotherapist is not aimed at groups, and it's not aimed at large systems of power. It's focused on the individual. Woke psychotherapy, informed by critical social justice theory, takes the therapeutic occasion as an opportunity to practice social activism. Psychotherapy works, as I said, with the individual. It may be that social activism becomes a component of what an individual psychotherapy client is inclined to do, but it's not the aim. So these are two separate disciplines, two separate ways of going about the world. From social justice theory, woke psychotherapy, The aim of therapy is activism and changing the world. The aim of a therapist is to help clients change their own individual and personal lives. So what about victimization? What about victim mentality? How does woke psychotherapy consider and work with, address victimhood? First, it divides people up into identity groups. There are those who belong to, depending on the intersectionality, being considered one or the other of an oppressed or marginalized and victimized group. If a client, by virtue of some outward trait, can be put in one of these groups, the effort will be to explore with them and educate them about how they're being victimized. Now, maybe sometimes this turns out to be useful. Maybe it's true. Maybe a person responds to this. But often I think what it does is it introduces the idea of victimization where it wasn't before and reinforces it. And it seems that the reason to do this is to recruit another activist and galvanize groups so that they can go to battle with systems of power, because the remedy for suffering and the remedy for life's problems is in getting the system to change. Things will get better if the system changes. That's where the power is. For the psychotherapist concerned with the individual, the emphasis is on activating and supporting an internal locus of power and control. In other words, the therapist helps the client to examine whatever thoughts, thinking patterns, and behaviors have contributed to their current circumstances, and also helps them to explore other ways of thinking, other ways of acting that might ameliorate their situation and make their life better. In other words, its emphasis is on personal responsibility and accountability and the cultivation of resilience. Assuming personal responsibility doesn't have to mean denying or ignoring ways that someone has been victimized by social injustices. It may even be that a psychotherapy client will choose to become a social activist, and this might be one of the ways that they begin to feel empowered. So personal responsibility doesn't preclude taking social action. However, taking social action does not exempt one, from the point of view of psychotherapy, from the personal work involved in healing and growth. If social activism is engaged but the personal work is not engaged, I think there's a higher likelihood of victim mentality and victimhood to be reinforced in one's identity. It may be, from a woke psychotherapist's point of view, that recruiting one more activist to the cause is a success for the therapy. In terms of the well-being of the individual client, I don't see it as a success. I see it as a failure. So why should psychotherapists be keen to avoid reinforcing a victim mentality in the clients that they work with? Let me first just separate out victimization from victimhood. Clearly, victimization happens and people can be victims. And victimhood is the state of having been a victim that might mobilize political action in an empowered sense to make changes. But to have a victim mentality means to see oneself as a victim for the sake of secondary gains. There's a reason that people would like to be attached to having a victim mentality. One is that if you can broadcast it, you'll receive attention and sympathy. In itself can be gratifying. You can avoid personal responsibility, which I've already alluded to. You can blame everybody else for what is bad in your life and not have to assume any blame for it yourself. You can avoid having to change anything. You just carry on the way you are and complain about how other people are keeping you there and simply wait for others to rescue you or for the world to change so that you'll be better, but you yourself don't have to make any changes. It gives one an excuse for not taking action because it's pointless, it's futile. There's no way that I can do anything about my circumstance because I'm a victim of the world. It provides a sense of social bonding with other similarly victimized people. And this can actually be a good thing in a sense if it allows for empathy, it allows for a sense of understanding, and perhaps it even leads to a group of people taking action. And I'm going to talk more about that later. But it can also just be an ongoing, what shall we call it? Pity party. Another secondary gain of declaring oneself to be a victim is that you have the moral high ground. You're the one who's been wronged. You haven't done anything wrong. It's all the other people who have done wrong, and you're on the high ground. Another big advantage of being a victim is that it can be weaponized. It can be used to silence dissent, gain power, and manipulate public opinion. Because there are these perks to declaring oneself to be a victim, it invites those who would make false claims or exaggerated claims to victimhood to take advantage of these perks and benefits. Take the famous example, just for one, of Jussie Smollett, who faked his attack by white supremacists in order to attract public attention and sympathy and presumably to boost his career as an actor. When these kinds of things happen and false allegations are made, if there are actual individuals they're being leveled against, then these people who are being accused can undergo all kinds of things: cancellation, lawsuits, loss of job, all kinds of things. Then what happens is what turned out to be an exaggerated or false claim of victimhood actually causes real victims. Generally, I believe there are two problematic ways that a psychotherapist can respond to a client who may have experienced social injustices and been victimized. One is valorization, which I think leads to victim mentality and a victim identity. The other is dismissal, or ignoring it, or not dealing with it altogether. A psychotherapist will be keen to avoid either of those two approaches. So how do I propose that a psychotherapist should respond to a client who may have experienced victimization due to social injustices? I've already suggested two of them, two of the ways that we can respond. One involves supporting the possibility of engaging in social activism, and the other involves doing personal work. First, however, I think it's important that the psychotherapist explores with the client the particulars of their experience of victimization and separate that from hypothetical, abstract, theoretical, possible ways that they imagine they've been victimized, for instance, by systemic oppression, unless those can be linked directly to lived experiences. Let's not forget the psychotherapeutic fiasco of false retrieved memories, in which therapists had clients believing that they had been sexually abused based on false memories, which cause all kinds of pain, disruption, and heartache in families when it didn't actually happen. I think there's a possibility that woke psychotherapy could be engaged in some similar version of that. But when the client's claim of victimization due to social injustices can be tied to actual lived experiences, how can the therapist help to facilitate them moving in the direction of activism if that's what they're inclined to do? I'm going to borrow from a 2014 paper titled A Theory of Victimhood, Politics, Conflict, and the Construction of Victim-Based Identity by a woman named Tami Jacoby. And there are 5 points here that she makes that I think can be guidelines or kind of guiding reference points for what a therapist might pay attention to in that process. The first thing that she identifies, the first step or stage, is structural conduciveness. In other words, first you have to determine that the person lives in a place where justice is valued, where there's something that the system might do around them to address their complaints. And living in a democratic society, as opposed to many other places in the world, I think for most cases we do live in a place that meets the requirements of structural conduciveness. The next step number 2, she calls political consciousness. This means to help the client precisely articulate how they have been harmed and any transgressions that harmed them and why they were wrong. At this point, they may or may not identify as a victim, but something has happened that's been unjust, and they can name it, and they can name why it wasn't right. The third step or stage she calls ideological coherence. Help the client map out their experiences against the broader social norms. Help them frame their own personal suffering against wider community concern, so that they recognize that it impacts not just themselves, but others, that they live in a world where what's happened to them is wrong in some sense, and that it affects not just them, but other people like them. The fourth one she calls political mobilization. Victims collectively seek recognition and sympathy from those that have more political power than they do. For instance, community leaders, government representatives. So they mobilize as a group and make their appeal to those in power who may be able to address their complaints. And the fifth step is political recognition. When victim advocacy influences those in power to recognize their claims and act in a way that restores justice. For instance, pass a law, change a policy, engage in restorative social justice programs, and so forth. So these are the basic steps that a person might go through and which a therapist might be able to support them in, especially recognizing that there are these 5 steps. The idea of victimhood could be the same as victim mentality or victim identity. However, it could also be the sense of solidarity with a group of people who've experienced the similar injustice, and in that sense, taking action on that is a form of empowerment, not a form of victim mentality. So doing this is not an abnegation of power. Still, it goes only so far, if far at all, in the direction of personal healing and personal growth. If taking this path turns out to be successful, it can be incredibly satisfying and empowering to those who take it. However, not all, if maybe only a few psychotherapy clients are going to be interested in engaging in social activism to address what they've experienced as victimization. I remember many years ago while working with Windhorse Integrative Mental Health Services in Massachusetts, we had a program whereby people who graduated from the program that we had, clients who graduated, would be invited to take a peer counseling and a peer advocacy training so that they could be part of therapeutic teams and advocate for other clients. This with a keen eye on any way that the power differential between the professional therapeutic providers and those they provide to was lopsided. Any way that decisions were made or things happened that would compromise the empowerment of the consumers. It's also connected to the consumer advocacy movement for mental health in the States. It's a great program, and we really valued the people who participated in it and helped us stay on track and provided great advocacy for other clients. However, not all people who graduated from the program were interested in joining up for that. And one person in particular was especially articulate about why. And he explained to me that he was very grateful for what had happened, but he wanted to move on. He wanted to get on with his life and not focus his identity and his activity and all of his aims around being a mental patient or a recovered mental patient. He wanted it to be a chapter in his life that he moved on from. And I very much understood and appreciated and respected his choice. Not everybody is going to want to choose to do that. And I don't think that therapists have the right to push this role on the people they work with. I don't think it's right for a therapist to push for a client to become an activist or to galvanize their identity around this part of their experience. It's our job to help them if they wish to, but if they don't, help them to move on. Now I want to turn to how traditional forms of psychotherapy can be employed to address victimization in general, including victimization at the hands of some social injustice. What I'm going to do is draw a parallel to something I've observed in my own practice over many years. I've noticed that there's a pattern or a trajectory of how people move through victimization because of experiences in their family of origin, usually at the hands of their parents, but sometimes the family system itself. That there's a pattern to it that I think maps on fairly well to a pattern that could be applied to victimization due to social injustice. Although there's great variety in the kinds of stories that I've heard over the years of how people have been treated in their families, and the process that I'm going to describe has variation to it. It's not etched in stone. It provides reference points that I think are useful. This is a sequence, so I'm going to start at the beginning. I decided to call this immersion in toxicity. And that's that the poor treatment by one's parents has been internalized. Often there's a great sense of shame, there's emotional dysregulation, addictions, troubled relationships, insecure attachment styles. Life has become hard to live as a result of this early poor parenting, poor holding environment in our developmental years. At this stage, for a psychotherapy client, if they come into therapy at this beginning stage, they're perplexed by why their life is a mess. They want to get some understanding of why they behave the way they do, the way they feel the way they do, the way they think, the reason they feel the way they do, but they don't know why, and they're looking for some answers. And primarily, they just want some relief from the painful symptoms that have cropped up in their lives. The next stage I've decided to call remembering and examining. And this means that the therapist helps the client to remember and examine their experiences of abuse and neglect, and recognizing how these were harmful to them and how they were wrong, that they didn't meet their basic developmental needs, and they caused damage. Another thing that therapists are meant to do is help clients recognize how early traumatic experiences have resulted in automatic ways that they see themselves and other people and their relationships. to solidify the belief that others are likely to be abusive and that they are likely to be victimized as the basis for an insecure and avoidant attachment style. The point isn't to restore a client's childlike naivety, but to open to the possibility for trust based on an understanding of when and how it can be earned. It isn't to validate and reinforce or educate about how to generalize these experiences as a template for understanding all relations, right? So all of us learn certain things about life in our early family experiences, and they become templates or lenses through which we see other people, ourselves, the world. They begin to set parameters for how we ought to act, and if we just act them out, then we get more of the same. It's why we've wound up at a therapist in the first place. It's because we've been acting out of this early conditioning. And this is where I think psychotherapy and critical social justice and woke psychotherapy part ways a bit because there's an examination of these things and not drawing grand conclusions about a system that of oppressing people who are always going to be that way. It's finding more subtlety and choice in our ability to understand ourselves and the world and open up options for how we proceed. When the experiences of victimization are identified and remembered and the associated emotions are evoked, the role of the therapist at that time is to validate and empathize with the client, assuming that their reports of victimization are credible, and usually they are. This phase of the work is variable, how long it goes on for different clients. It can last a very long time or less time. But at some point, what is necessary is to move on to the other steps or the other stages that I'll be describing. What I've discovered, and it's known, I think, that understanding one's traumas, being able to even identify their impact on our lives and have insight about their effects itself is not sufficient for healing. It's necessary, but not enough. There are more things we need to do. I would say the same with empathy. Empathy is necessary, but not sufficient. If all we do is provide empathy, we just provide a safe place for a person to endlessly recount their traumas, their victimizations, to re-experience those feelings, to have a witness who's warm and caring and has unconditional positive regard and validates those feelings and empathizes with them. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient. At some point, something more is needed. I think there are a lot of therapists who really believe in unconditional positive regard and empathy, and that if that is what they provide, that will be enough. I, myself, tried to believe that for a very long time and discovered that it wasn't. That at some point, taking personal responsibility, taking the risk of challenging new behaviors and all the rest of it becomes important. At some point, a therapist needs to help their client move outside of their comfort zone, outside of their habitual way of being and try new things. This is not just true for psychotherapy clients and how therapists ought to work with them. It's true for all of us. It's true for me. It's true for you. It's just universally true that if we don't go beyond our comfort zone, if we take comfort in being a victim and receiving caring sympathy and loving support and validation, and we don't move beyond that, then we stay stuck. And I wish it wasn't so, sort of, not really, but it turns out I don't think it works that way. more is required. Having remembered and examined one's past traumatic, usually experiences of having been victimized, the next step along the way that I see happen is that internalized feelings of shame and negativity toward oneself begin to be transmuted into anger and wanting to hold those who were unfair or who were abusive accountable. It can usher in a time of volatile relations with one's parents if they're still alive, and the effort to get them to admit what they did and to change the way they behave and act like decent parents. There's a lot of anger in this. The next step that I see, and it's not always this sequential. This step can come a little earlier and then develop more later, but I'd call it self-compassion and self-care. It's the recognition that we have to take care of ourselves, that this is the beginning of personal responsibility. This is where one realizes, where the therapist helps the client to realize that there are things that they can do to help themselves, to help regulate their emotions, to find a place of peace, to protect themselves, and to do things that bring them joy and satisfaction. Anyway, it's a time of self-compassion and self-care. Part of this self-care can involve establishing boundaries with those in one's family that have been toxic or abusive. And that can be how often you see them, what you talk to them about, or if it's particularly toxic and unworkable, the boundary might be that a family member, even a parent, needs to be cut out of one's life. But this is, in a sense, it's motivated by the anger, but it's also informed by self-care and self-compassion. And at some point in this process, the emphasis becomes the client's vision for their life, their aspirations, their goals, is what they want to make of their life. And that becomes what is most important. And trying to change or resolve or get satisfaction out of toxic parents is let go of, surrendered, and perhaps grieved. But the move is toward pursuing one's own life. So while I've described this in the context of family relations, a person's relationship with their own parents, it could also be mapped onto the experience of victimization by social injustices. A similar path could be taken. Now, I want to back up a little bit and talk about the angry phase. Now, I see this as a really important and valuable turn of events when any of us can become angry about having been mistreated. It means that we're no longer internalizing the message of something being wrong with us, whether it's parents or whether it's society or racists or homophobes or anything. It's going, no, I'm not going to let that make me feel ashamed of myself. Fuck that. It also mobilizes taking action, whether that be political action or whether that means setting boundaries on people or taking self-care measures. So it's really important. However, I've noticed that it can become a place to get stuck. And part of the reason I think we get stuck here is that the allure of victim mentality holds us there. The desire to blame other people for our circumstances is strong, and we can get stuck here. And especially if the anger that we feel doesn't mobilize action, doesn't lead to doing something constructive, then it becomes toxic. Then it becomes bitterness and resentment, and it becomes a weight that drags us down and leaves us in places of anxiety and depression. that anger is not being used properly. It could be used properly. In a metaphor that's made sense to me, although I know that all metaphors have their limits, but this makes some sense to me. I think of anger like fuel in a section of a rocket, right? Rocket shoots up into space and it's propelled beyond the atmosphere, and one of its sections that contained a lot of the fuel needs to be let go of because it is run out of fuel. It's not pushing you any further, and it's a weight that pulls you back down. So it has to be let go of. And I see anger like that. That if we don't realize that it has a usefulness to a point and then it needs to be let go of, it winds up dragging us back down. When our anger leaves us believing that our lives cannot be okay unless other people change, other people that are to blame, other people we're angry at, unless we can get them to do something different or we can destroy them, our lives will not be okay. This is an impediment to moving forward. You may have noticed that some of this maps onto Tami Jacoby's model, particularly her second stage, political consciousness, the articulating transgressions and why they were or are wrong. The rest of her model aims at political activism, but it could be applied as well to personal growth and healing. In a sense, instead of looking to those in power to make changes, look to oneself. What changes can oneself make? So there's a correlation between these two, but the directions they go are different. One goes to the collective group and the system that the group lives in, and the other goes to the individual. Critical social justice theory pushes back against this with the idea that it borders on, or it is, blaming the victim, that somehow this approach expects people to pick themselves up by their bootstraps and do impossible things. On the surface, this would seem to violate the principles of compassion or the impulse to help relieve the suffering of others. More or less, people who have been victimized by a social injustice need to be saved. While this may appear to be a compassionate response, in practice, I think it can become nothing more than a signal of virtue that helps the esteem of the person promoting it and does little to actually help the person who's suffering. Sometimes we may need saving, but more often, I think, we're helped by being allowed to struggle with our difficulties and cultivate our own resilience. I don't believe that it's helpful to be told that there's very little we can do and then to be rescued or then to wait to be rescued. While our social network is there, hopefully, to provide support and assistance when we need it, it's also there to hold us accountable. And I think that a therapist can provide both of these, both support and assistance and accountability. To call this blaming the victim, I think, is a clever appeal to superficial forms of compassion. Why couldn't we just call it locating power and control internally? This, I believe, is actually the more compassionate approach and far more effective than mere virtue signaling. Critical social justice theory, through woke psychotherapy, has highlighted the reality of social injustices that victimize people. And it's insisted that psychotherapists take this seriously and realize that this has had an impact on many of the people that they will see as clients. I believe that this is an important contribution and we should take it seriously. But what we do with it is another matter. However, woke psychotherapy has blind spots, and its praxis is problematic. It does not integrate well or play well with well-established principles of psychotherapy. And what makes things worse is its unwillingness to engage in critical dialogue. I think this is ironic for a system of thought that prides itself on being critical of hegemonic systems. I think there are better ways to integrate its contributions into the field of psychotherapy and probably everywhere else, ways that are better than the ones that they propose. That's what this whole series under the title of Questioning Woke Psychotherapy is about. So, if you're hearing my voice right now, you've stayed with me to the end. I really appreciate it. Thanks for staying with me. If you like the video, please give it a like, subscribe to my channel, leave me comments. Love to have comments, and share it with a friend or somebody who might be interested. And in your comments, if there's some topic or area of this whole thing that you want me to explore, let me know. I'm open to suggestions. But for now, that's all. I wish you well. Take care of yourself, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye-bye.